When the wealthy rancher's fiancée vanished, every finger in town pointed at the mountain man, a stranger with a hard stare. The sheriff called him a madman, but weeks later he returned, carrying a truth no one saw coming. It happened in a dusty town under the scorching sun of the 1880s, when prejudice blinded all but one. This story reveals how far a man will go to prove his honor. Stay with us to discover what it means to be an outcast, yet remain human. Hey there, folks. How's it going, and where are you listening from? The sun beat down on Sagebrush, a small town nestled in a valley where dust clung to everything. The streets buzzed with the usual chaos. Merchants hawked their wares, horses snorted, and saloon doors swung with every drunk stumbling out. But that morning, a different kind of noise spread through the crowd. Whispers about Clara, the fiancée of wealthy rancher Tom Haskell, who hadn't been seen since last night. Her absence sent ripples of panic through the townsfolk, who gathered in clumps, trading theories under the relentless sun. By noon, suspicion landed on Jedediah Kane, the mountain man who lived on the edge of nowhere and rarely showed his face in town. Jedediah's cabin sat high in the hills, a good day's ride from Sagebrush, and his rare visits always drew stares. He was a tall figure, broad-shouldered, with a beard that hid most of his weathered face, and eyes that seemed to see right through folks. He'd come down maybe twice a year for supplies, flour, salt, a few bullets, and never lingered. That day, he'd been spotted near the saloon trading furs for coin, his presence quiet but heavy, like a storm cloud. When Clara's horse was found riderless near the canyon trail, the townsfolk didn't hesitate. "It's got to be the mountain man," a shopkeeper muttered, and the crowd nodded, their fear turning to blame. No one knew much about Jedediah, and that was enough to make him guilty in their eyes. His silence, his solitary life in the mountains, the way he avoided small talk, it all painted him as strange, maybe dangerous. A woman swore she saw him near the canyon the night Clara vanished, though her story shifted with every retelling. Another claimed he'd been muttering to himself, wild-eyed, though no one could confirm it. The whispers grew louder, angrier, until they became a chorus of accusation. By evening, the saloon was alive with talk of forming a posse to drag Jedediah back for answers. Clara's disappearance wasn't just a mystery. It was a wound to the town's pride. She was young, bright, and set to marry Haskell, whose cattle empire kept Sagebrush afloat. Her loss threatened more than just a wedding. It shook the town's sense of safety. Jedediah, with his outsider ways, was an easy target. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the dusty streets, a man spat into the dirt and said, "That mountain man's got no business here." Probably took her to his shack. No one questioned it. The idea stuck like burrs to a saddle. The town square baked under the midday sun, packed with folks itching for answers. Sheriff Amos Reed stood on a crate, his badge glinting as he raised a hand to quiet the crowd. His voice boomed, calling Jedediah Kane a madman who'd likely spirited Clara away to his mountain hideout. The accusation landed hard. People jeered, some spat, others shouted for justice before any evidence surfaced. Jedediah stood at the edge of the crowd, his worn coat dusty from the trail, his face unreadable as the sheriff's words cut through the air. The sheriff's speech wasn't just a call to action, it was a performance. Amos had been sheriff for a decade, a man who thrived on control and the town's reliance on him. Labeling Jedediah as the culprit was easier than admitting he had no leads. "That mountain man's got no roots here," Amos declared, pointing toward the hills. "He's got no reason to be loyal to us or our ways." The crowd roared agreement, their fear of the unknown fueling their anger. A few men, liquored up from the saloon, yelled about stringing Jedediah up without a trial. Jedediah didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his boots heavy on the packed dirt, and the crowd parted slightly, wary of his size and silence. When he spoke, his voice was low, steady, cutting through the noise like a blade. "If Clara's in the mountains, I'll find her. You got my word." The words hung there, simple but heavy, and for a moment, the square went quiet. Then a ranch hand laughed, breaking the spell, and others joined in, mocking his promise as the ravings of a fool. Amos smirked, waving him off. "Go on then, madman. Run to your hills." Jedediah turned without another word, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his pack heavy with what little he carried. The crowd's laughter followed him as he walked out of sagebrush, his figure shrinking against the vast rocky horizon. No one believed he'd find Clara. Most thought he was running to save his own skin. But as he disappeared into the distance, a few older townsfolk, men who'd seen the mountain's cruelty, exchanged glances. They knew the trails Jedediah walked weren't kind to liars or cowards. Sagebrush settled into an uneasy rhythm after Jedediah's departure, the air thick with gossip and doubt. Townsfolk gathered in the saloon, their voices a mix of certainty and unease as they debated the mountain man's guilt. Some swore he'd kidnapped Clara for ransom, spinning tales of a crazed hermit hoarding secrets in his cabin. Others, quieter, wondered if they'd been too quick to judge, their words drowned out by the clink of whiskey glasses and bold claims. Tom Haskell, Clara's fiancé, paced outside his sprawling ranch house, his wealth doing little to ease his desperation. He offered a hefty reward, $500 in gold, to anyone who brought Clara back, dead or alive. The promise stirred the town further, drawing greedy eyes from drifters and cowhands who saw a chance to cash in. In the saloon, a wiry man named Cutler, known for his quick draw and quicker temper, scoffed loudly. "That mountain fool's probably lost in his own hills by now," he said, slamming his glass down. "If he's guilty, he's long gone. If he ain't, he's dead." The room erupted in laughter, but a few older men at the bar stayed silent, their weathered faces unreadable. These elders, men who'd trapped and hunted in the mountains decades ago, knew the kind of man Jedediah was. They'd seen his type before, solitary, stubborn, shaped by the wild more than by towns or talk. One of them, Old Man Grayson, sipped his drink and muttered to no one in particular. "Takes a certain kind to walk those trails alone. Kane ain't the running type." His words didn't carry far, lost in the din of drunken bets and boasts about who'd claim Haskell's gold. But the respect in Grayson's eyes lingered, a quiet acknowledgement of the mountain man's grit. By nightfall, the town's mood had hardened. Most believed Jedediah was either a villain or a fool, and few cared which. The saloon stayed loud, filled with plans to form a posse if Clara wasn't found soon. Outside, the wind carried dust through empty streets, and the mountains loomed in the distance, silent witnesses to the truth no one in Sagebrush cared to seek. The elders' glances held a flicker of doubt, but the town's judgment had already been cast. Jedediah Kane moved through the mountains with the steady rhythm of a man who knew their secrets. The trails were unforgiving, jagged rocks tore at his boots, and the thin air burned his lungs as he climbed higher into the wilderness. He followed faint signs, a broken twig here, a scuff on a stone there, clues most would miss, but clear as day to a man who'd spent years tracking game. Clara was out there, somewhere, and he meant to find her, no matter the cost to his body or the town's scorn. Each night he built a small fire in a sheltered hollow, the flames casting shadows on the canyon walls. Sitting cross-legged, he chewed on jerky and studied the ground, piecing together the trail like a puzzle. Sometimes he spoke aloud, his voice low, as if the mountains themselves were listening. "She ain't far now," he'd mutter, tracing a mark in the dirt with a stick. "Someone's moving her, keeping her hidden." The words weren't for anyone else, just a way to keep his thoughts sharp against the loneliness of the peaks. The mountains weren't silent. They whispered with distant coyote calls and the rustle of wind through pines. Jedediah caught echoes of voices once, faint and fleeting, carried down a narrow gorge. He froze, head tilted, parsing the sounds. Men, at least 3, their words too garbled to make out, but their tone sharp with purpose. He marked the spot in his mind, knowing it was no hunting party. His hand rested on the worn handle of his knife, a blade that had skinned deer and defended his life more than once. His body ached, blisters on his feet, a gash on his arm from a fall, but he pressed on, driven by something deeper than the town's accusations. It wasn't just about proving them wrong. It was about Clara, a woman he'd barely met, but whose life now rested on his stubborn will. The stars overhead offered no answers, only cold light as he packed up his camp at dawn and moved deeper into the maze of cliffs and canyons. Every step took him farther from sagebrush and closer to a truth he could feel in his bones. The air grew colder as Jedediah Kane pushed deeper into the mountains, where shadows clung to the cliffs like old ghosts. He'd been tracking for days, following a trail that was starting to tell a story, one he didn't like. Near a dry creek bed, he found the remains of a small camp, charred wood, a scrap of torn cloth, and hoofprints leading toward a narrow pass. Kneeling, he touched the cloth, recognizing the fine weave. It matched the kind of dress Clara might wear. His jaw tightened, and he knew he was closing in on something ugly. The signs pointed to a group, likely outlaws, moving fast to stay hidden. Jedediah pieced it together as he climbed a rocky ridge, his breath visible in the crisp dawn. He overheard more fragments of voices the previous night, carried by the wind through a jagged canyon. Crouching behind a boulder, he caught words about a buyer and a deal in a town 2 days' ride away. The realization hit him hard. Clara wasn't just missing. She was a bargaining chip, her life priced like cattle. Time was slipping away, and the weight of it pressed on his chest. He moved with purpose, his body protesting but his mind sharp. The trail led to a high plateau where he spotted fresh tracks, boots, not hooves, circling a cluster of pines. He crept closer, his rifle ready, and saw the faint glow of a campfire flickering through the trees. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from the certainty that he'd found them. He didn't know how many men he'd face or what they'd do to Clara if cornered, but hesitation wasn't in him. Lying flat on the cold ground, Jedediah studied the camp from a distance. 3 men, maybe 4, their laughter rough as they passed a bottle around. Clara was there. He couldn't see her yet, but he felt it, like a hunter sensing prey. The thought of her fear, her hopelessness, stirred something fierce in him. He gripped his knife, its blade catching the moonlight. Whatever came next, he'd face it head on, because turning back wasn't an option. Not for a man who'd given his word. Darkness cloaked the mountain plateau as Jedediah Kane edged closer to the outlaws' camp, his movements silent as a shadow. The firelight flickered, revealing 4 men sprawled around a dying blaze, their rifles propped against a log. Jedediah's eyes narrowed, scanning for Clara, and there she was, huddled near the fire, wrists bound, her face pale but defiant. The sight of her, alive but trapped, sent a surge of purpose through him, steadying his hands as he gripped his knife and old rifle. He counted the men again, 4, all armed, their voices slurred from whiskey but sharp with menace. One, a lanky figure with a scar across his cheek, barked at Clara to stay quiet, his words dripping with threat. Jedediah's blood ran hot, but he forced himself to wait, calculating every move. The camp was open on one side, flanked by pines with a steep drop-off beyond. A wrong step could mean death for him or Clara, and he wasn't about to let haste ruin his chance. He crept to a boulder 10 yards from the fire, close enough to hear their talk. The scarred man laughed, saying, "Haskell's gold will be ours by week's end once we hand her over." Another grunted agreement, mentioning a buyer in Redstone, a rough town 2 days west. Jedediah's grip tightened on his rifle. This wasn't just a kidnapping. It was a transaction, and Clara's life hung on their greed. He had to act tonight, before they moved her again. With the moon hidden behind clouds, Jedediah slipped toward the camp, his boots soundless on the rocky ground. He targeted the scarred man first, lunging from the dark with his knife. The blade found its mark before the outlaw could shout, and Jedediah rolled behind a tree as the others scrambled for their guns. Shots rang out, splitting the night, but Jedediah moved like a wolf, his rifle barking once, twice, dropping 2 more. The last man lunged at him, but Jedediah's fist met his jaw, sending him sprawling. In the chaos, Clara's wide eyes locked on his, and he saw something there, not just fear, but trust. The air stank of gunpowder and blood as Jedediah Kane stood over the fallen outlaws, his chest heaving from the fight. Clara sat frozen by the fire, her bound hands trembling, her eyes wide with shock, but alive with something fierce. Hope, maybe, or defiance. Jedediah crossed the camp in 3 strides, his knife flashing as he cut the ropes around her wrists. "I promised I'd find you," he said, his voice rough but steady, like the mountains themselves. She nodded, unable to speak, her breath catching as she rubbed her raw wrists. The camp was a mess. Overturned gear, a spilled bottle of whiskey soaking into the dirt, and the bodies of the 4 men sprawled where they'd fallen. Jedediah didn't linger on them. He'd done what he had to, no more, no less. He grabbed a canteen from the ground, handed it to Clara, and scanned the darkness for signs of others. The night was still, but he knew better than to trust it. "We move now," he told her, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. They might have friends nearby. Clara stood, shaky but determined, her dress torn and her face smudged with dirt. "They said they'd sell me," she whispered, her voice cracking but clear, "to some trader in Redstone. Haskell's gold was their price." Jedediah's jaw clenched at the mention of her fiancé's name, but he said nothing, only nodded toward the trail. He led her away from the camp, his eyes darting to every shadow, every snap of a twig. The weight of what she'd said settled on him. Haskell's wealth had drawn these men, and Clara had paid the price. Their escape was slow, deliberate, through a maze of pines and rocky outcrops. Clara stumbled once, her strength fading, but Jedediah caught her arm, steadying her without a word. The mountains loomed around them, their silence both a shield and a threat. He knew the outlaw's buyer might still be out there, and the trail back to Sagebrush was long. But as Clara walked beside him, her steps growing steadier, Jedediah felt the fire in his gut burn brighter. He'd kept his word, and that was enough for now. The mountain trail stretched endlessly before Jedediah, Kane, and Clara, its rocky paths baked by the relentless sun. Each step kicked up dust that clung to their clothes, and the heat pressed down like a heavy hand, sapping their strength. Clara's torn dress snagged on thorns, and her breaths came shallow, but she pushed forward, driven by the will to survive. Jedediah led the way, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit, his rifle gripped tightly, ready for trouble. Their journey was grueling, the terrain punishing their already battered bodies. Clara's feet bled through her thin shoes, and Jedediah's wounds from the fight, a deep cut on his arm, bruises across his ribs, throbbed with every move. When she stumbled, too weak to stand, he hoisted her onto his shoulders without a word, carrying her weight as if it were nothing. "Keep your eyes open," he said, his voice steady despite the strain. "We're not clear yet." Clara nodded, clinging to him, her silence louder than any thanks. Halfway down a steep ravine, Jedediah froze, catching the faint clatter of hooves echoing behind them. He set Clara down behind a boulder and crouched, peering through the brush. 2 riders, likely stragglers from the outlaw's crew, were tracking their trail, their voices carrying threats of revenge. Jedediah's hand tightened on his knife, but he didn't move. "Stay low," he whispered to Clara, who pressed herself against the rock, her face pale but resolute. The riders passed, their horses kicking up stones, unaware of the eyes watching from the shadows. As night fell, they found a shallow cave to rest. Jedediah built no fire, wary of giving away their position. He gave Clara his coat to ward off the chill, and sat at the cave's mouth, rifle across his lap, listening to the wind howl through the peaks. Clara's voice broke the silence, soft but firm. "Why'd you come for me?" "You didn't have to." Jedediah stared into the dark, his answer slow but honest. "Because no one else would." The words hung between them, heavy with the truth of a world that had judged him before he'd even spoken. The first light of dawn broke over Sagebrush, painting the dusty streets in hues of gold and gray. Jedediah, Kane, and Clara emerged from the canyon trail, their figures small against the vast horizon, battered but alive. Clara leaned on his arm, her steps unsteady, her face gaunt from weeks of captivity and the grueling trek. The townsfolk, scattered outside the saloon and general store, froze mid-conversation, their eyes wide with disbelief as the pair shuffled into view. A hush fell over the street, broken only by the creak of a sign swinging in the breeze. Jedediah's coat was torn, his face streaked with dirt and blood, but he stood tall, his gaze steady as he guided Clara forward. She clung to his shoulder, her torn dress barely holding together, yet her chin was raised, defiance flickering in her eyes. The crowd parted, some stepping back in shame, others staring in awe. A woman whispered, "It's her," and the word spread like wildfire, drawing more people from their homes. Tom Haskell burst from his ranch house, his boots pounding the dirt, but stopped short when he saw Clara's hand on Jedediah's arm. Sheriff Amos Reed pushed through the gathering, his badge catching the morning light. His face drained of color as he met Jedediah's eyes, the mountain man's silence louder than any accusation. You found her," Amos stammered, his voice betraying a mix of relief and unease. Jedediah didn't answer, just nodded toward Clara, who stepped forward, her voice weak but clear. "He saved me." From men who wanted gold, the crowd murmured, some looking away, their earlier jeers now a bitter memory. No one moved to help as Jedediah steadied Clara toward the doctor's office. A boy ran ahead, shouting for the doc, while others stood frozen, grappling with the truth. The mountain man, the outcast they'd mocked, had done what none of them dared. Haskell reached for Clara, but she flinched, her hand tightening on Jedediah's sleeve. The gesture was small but spoke volumes, and the townsfolk saw it. Jedediah's work was done, but the weight of their judgment lingered in the air, heavy as the dust at their feet. The doctor's office smelled of liniment and old wood as Clara sat on a cot, her hands clutching a tin cup of water. Jedediah stood by the door, his broad frame filling the threshold, his eyes fixed on the street outside where the crowd still lingered. The townsfolk's whispers had softened, replaced by an uneasy silence, their earlier accusations now a bitter pill they couldn't swallow. Clara's words about her rescue hung over Sagebrush like a storm cloud, forcing everyone to face the man they'd wronged. Tom Haskell hovered near Clara, his face a mix of relief and frustration, his hands twitching as if unsure whether to reach for her. "You're safe now," he said, his voice loud enough for the room to hear. "That's what matters." But Clara's eyes stayed on Jedediah, and she shook her head slightly. "Safe because of him," she said, her voice steady despite her frailty. "Not you, Tom. Not the town." The words cut deep, and Haskell's jaw tightened, his wealth and status useless against her quiet rebuke. Outside, the crowd began to disperse, some slipping away to avoid Jedediah's gaze, others lingering as if waiting for him to demand something. Thanks, an apology, anything. He gave them nothing. He adjusted his rifle strap and turned to leave, his boots heavy on the creaking floorboards. Clara called after him, her voice soft but urgent. "You don't have to go. They owe you." Jedediah paused, his back to her, and shook his head. "Don't need their debts," he said, his tone final. "Got my own to settle." He stepped into the street, the sun high and unforgiving, casting his shadow long across the dirt. The townsfolk watched him go, their faces a mix of guilt and awe. A few children trailed at a distance, curious about the man who'd become a legend in a single morning. Jedediah didn't look back. Sagebrush had judged him once, and he'd answered with action, not words. The mountains were calling, and he belonged to them, not to the town's fleeting gratitude or shame. The saloon doors swung shut behind a handful of men, their boots scuffing the worn floorboards as they settled at the bar. The usual clamor of Sagebrush's watering hole was gone, replaced by a heavy quiet that seemed to press against the walls. Clara's return and Jedediah's silent departure had left a mark, and the townsfolk couldn't shake it. Conversations were hushed, glasses clinked softly, and eyes darted to the empty street where the mountain man had walked away. A ranch hand, his face flushed from whiskey, broke the silence, his voice low but bitter. "We called him a madman, and he brought her back." "What's that make us?" The question hung unanswered, met only by the creak of a chair, as old man Grayson leaned forward. "Makes us fools," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "Cain did what we wouldn't. Ain't no madness in that." The saloon fell quieter still, the weight of his words sinking into the men who'd jeered loudest weeks before. Sheriff Amos Reed sat in a corner, his hat pulled low, nursing a drink he barely touched. He'd tried to speak earlier, mumbling about how he'd been protecting the town, but his excuses fell flat, drowned out by the crowd's newfound contempt. A woman at a nearby table, her voice sharp, muttered, "You led the charge, Amos," pointed fingers with no proof. The sheriff's shoulders sagged, his authority crumbling under the town's shifting gaze. No one called for his badge, but the silence around him was punishment enough. The talk turned to Jedediah, his name now spoken with a mix of guilt and reverence. A trapper at the bar, his hands scarred from years in the wild, said, "He ain't one of us, never was." but he's more man than most here." Heads nodded, and for the first time, the mountain man wasn't a stranger, just a truth they hadn't faced. The saloon's air grew thick with unspoken apologies, but Jedediah was already gone, and Sagebrush was left to wrestle with its own conscience. The mountains rose sharp and silent as Jedediah Kane climbed the familiar trail to his cabin, the weight of sagebrush far behind him. The wind carried the scent of pine and earth, a balm to his bruised body and weary mind. His boots crunched on the rocky path, each step a return to the solitude he'd chosen long ago, where the only judgment came from the sky and the stone. He didn't look back at the town, didn't need to. Its dust and its guilt were no longer his burden. His cabin came into view, a rough-hewn shelter tucked against a cliff, its walls weathered by years of storms. Inside, he set his rifle by the door and sank onto a stool, the quiet wrapping around him like an old friend. The fire he lit crackled softly, casting shadows on the walls where pelts and tools hung, the only traces of his life. He thought of Clara's eyes, the way they'd held trust when he cut her free, and of the townsfolk's silence as he left. No reward, no thanks, just the truth, hard-won and heavy. Down in Sagebrush, stories about Jedediah began to take root, whispered in saloons and around hearths. The mountain man who'd faced death to save one of their own became a tale told with a mix of awe and shame. Children mimicked his walk, slow and deliberate, while elders spoke of him as a warning. Truth don't bend to a crowd's anger, yet Jedediah sought no glory, no place in their songs. His name carried weight not because he wanted it, but because he'd done what was right when no one else would. As night fell, Jedediah sat by his fire, the stars bright above the peaks. He carved a notch into a stick, a habit from years alone, marking another day survived. The town's mistakes, its quick judgments, would linger in Sagebrush, but up here they were just echoes lost in the wind. He leaned back, his eyes on the flames, and let the mountain's silence speak. Sometimes, he thought, the truest thing a man can do is walk away, leaving others to face the mirror he held up.